Power buys compliance. Fear buys silence. Cash usually buys both. Damien was used to a world where everything had a price tag, including the people. Then he met Naomi. He put $10,000 on a worn laminate counter to cover up a bloody mistake. She slid it right back. No panic, no posturing. Just a flat, tired refusal. When a man who owns the city meets a woman who doesn't want his money, the foundation of his reality cracks. And that's exactly where the obsession begins. The smell of perchloroethylene and scorched cotton was baked into Naomi's skin. It was Tuesday, 11:40 at night, and the neon sign in the window of Hayes Custom Care was the only light still buzzing on the block. The street outside was slick with October rain, reflecting the bleak amber of the street lamps. Naomi pressed her knuckles into the small of her back, feeling the familiar dull ache of a 14-hour shift. She reached up to kill the open sign. Before her fingers brushed the switch, the heavy glass door pushed open. The bell above it didn't chime. It gave a strangled clatter. The man who walked in brought the cold in with him. He was tall, built with the kind of dense, quiet muscle that ruined the lines of off-the-rack suits. But his suit wasn't off the rack. Even in the harsh fluorescent glare of the dry cleaners, Naomi could spot the drape of bespoke Italian wool, charcoal gray, impeccable stitching, ruined. He didn't speak. He stepped up to the counter, his dark eyes sweeping the empty shop before settling on her. They were flat, assessing eyes. The kind of eyes that looked at a person and calculated exactly how much pressure it would take to break them. Naomi didn't flinch. You worked a night shift in the South End long enough. You learned that flinching was an invitation. He shrugged off the heavy overcoat, then slipped out of the suit jacket. He laid the jacket on the counter. The thud it made was too heavy for wool. A gun in the inside pocket, maybe. Or just the sheer weight of whatever was soaking the right sleeve. Can you save it? His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. Naomi pulled the jacket toward her. The fabric was stiff, tacky to the touch near the cuff. She didn't need to look closely at the dark, rust-colored stain spreading up the forearm to know what it was. It smelled like wet pennies and raw iron. Blood. A lot of it. And judging by the fact that the man standing across from her wasn't bleeding, it belonged to someone else. She smoothed her thumb over the lapel. The wool is Super 150S. Delicate. Blood sets fast in this kind of weave. I can try an enzyme treatment, but if it's been sitting for more than a few hours, it's going to leave a shadow. Do your best. He reached into his slacks. Naomi braced herself, her hand drifting toward the heavy iron tailor's shears under the counter. But he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was heavy, fat with paper, and sealed with tape. He placed it on the counter, right next to the ruined sleeve. For the cleaning, he said. His gaze held hers, an unspoken weight pressing down on every syllable. And for the quiet. You didn't see me. You don't know me. You just clean clothes. Naomi stared at the envelope. She knew exactly what it was. It was a lifeline. It was 3 months of back rent. It was the repair bill for the commercial steamer that kept dying every Thursday. It was breathing room. She looked up at him. The man expected a reaction. Greed. Fear. A nervous nod. Naomi sighed. It was a long, ragged sound. She reached for the envelope. The man's jaw relaxed a fraction. A micro-expression of cynical satisfaction. Everyone had a price. He had just met hers. Naomi slid the envelope across the laminate. She pushed it until it bumped against his knuckles. He stared at it, then back at her. The satisfaction vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp stillness. "Is it not enough?" "It's too much," Naomi said, her voice flat. She turned to the cash register and punched in a sequence of keys. The machine whirred, spitting out a small white slip. She ripped it off and placed it on the counter beside his hand. "Enzyme treatment, deep clean, and hand press, $45.50, Naomi said. She pulled a yellow claim ticket from the roll and stapled half to the collar of the jacket. She handed him the other half. "I require payment up front for biological stains." The man looked at the little yellow piece of paper, then at the envelope containing at least $10,000 in untraceable cash. "You don't understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly," Naomi replied. She crossed her arms, ignoring the way her shoulders screamed in protest. "You had a messy night. You need your coat cleaned. I'm a dry cleaner. I do not want your envelope. If I take your envelope, I work for you. I don't work for you. I clean your clothes. Pay the $45.50 or take the jacket somewhere else." Silence stretched between them. It was thick, heavy, suffocating. The buzzing of the neon sign outside felt deafening. Damien studied the woman. She was pale, her dark hair pulled back in a messy clip, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. She wasn't playing a game. There was no defiance in her posture, just a bone-deep exhaustion and an unyielding boundary. She knew he was dangerous. She knew what the blood meant. And she was looking him in the eye, telling him she preferred poverty to his brand of patronage. Slowly, deliberately, Damien reached into his wallet. He pulled out a $50 bill and laid it on the receipt. "Keep the change," he said softly. "I don't take tips on specialty jobs." Naomi opened the register, counted out 4 $1 bills and 2 quarters, and placed them on the counter. Damien looked at the coins. He looked at her. For the first time in a decade, he didn't know what to say. He picked up his change, picked up the envelope, and pocketed the yellow claim ticket. "Thursday," Naomi said, turning her back to him to hang the jacket on the processing rack. "It'll be ready by Thursday after 4. When she turned back around, the shop was empty. The boiler died on Friday morning. Naomi stood in the cramped basement of the shop, staring at the rusting iron beast that had been her grandfather's pride and joy. Water pooled around her boots, thick with sludge. The repairman had given her a quote an hour ago. $3,000. She had exactly $412 in her business account. She walked upstairs, her boots squelching on the linoleum, and flipped the sign to closed. She needed to think. She needed a loan. She needed a miracle that didn't involve selling her soul. A sleek black town car idled at the curb. Naomi watched through the glass as a man stepped out. He wasn't the man from Tuesday night. This one was younger, flashier, wearing a sharp navy suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked to the door, rattled the handle, and knocked. Naomi cracked the door open. "Shop's closed. Boiler issues." "Miss Hayes?" The man smiled, holding out a crisp white envelope. "I'm Leo. I work for Mr. Russo." "I don't know a Mr. Russo." "Tuesday night, charcoal jacket. You did an excellent job, by the way. The shadow is barely noticeable." Leo pushed the envelope toward her. "Mr. Russo is a man who appreciates quality work, and he appreciates discretion. He heard about your mechanical troubles. He wants to make an investment." Naomi didn't touch the envelope. "How did he know about my boiler?" "The repairman just left." Leo's smile widened slightly. Mr. Russo owns the building you lease, Miss Hayes. He acquired it yesterday. He also knows the repair company. Consider this a gesture of goodwill between a landlord and a valued tenant. The cold hit her then, a slow, creeping chill that started in her chest and radiated outward. He acquired the building. "Open it," Leo urged gently. Naomi hesitated, then snatched the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, issued to Hayes Custom Care. The amount was $50,000. "Mr. Russo likes to ensure the people in his neighborhood are taken care of," Leo said. "No strings. Just fix the boiler. Keep the shop running. Keep doing good work." Leo tipped his head and walked back to the town car. Naomi stood in the doorway, staring at the slip of paper in her hands. 50 grand. It would fix the boiler. It would pay off her debts. It would secure the shop for another 2 years. It was also a collar. Naomi knew men like Russo. She grew up in this city. You take a gift from the mob, and suddenly you owe them a favor. Then another. Soon, your back room is being used to store stolen goods, or your vats are being used to wash more than just blood out of clothes. You don't accept charity from apex predators. She marched to the register, grabbed her keys, and locked the shop. Finding Damian Russo wasn't hard if you knew who to ask. The neighborhood gossiped. Russo operated out of the Velvet Room, a high-end supper club 3 blocks away. The rain had started again by the time Naomi reached the club. The bouncers at the door, 2 massive men in dark suits, stepped in her way as she approached. "Private club," one rumbled. Naomi held up the envelope. "I have a delivery for Mr. Russo. From Naomi Hayes." The bouncer tapped an earpiece, murmured something, and listened. He looked Naomi up and down, frowned, and stepped aside. "Back booth." The inside of the club smelled of expensive cigars, roasted garlic, and old money. The lighting was dim, washing the room in deep reds and shadows. Naomi ignored the stares of the patrons. Her boots left damp footprints on the plush carpet. She found him in the back. Damian sat alone in a curved leather booth, a glass of amber liquid on the table in front of him. In the dim light, he looked even more dangerous. Relaxed, utterly in control, watching her approach with an unreadable expression. Naomi didn't sit. She walked right up to the table and slammed the cashier's check down onto the polished mahogany. The sound cracked like a whip over the low jazz playing in the background. A few tables over, 2 men half stood, reaching inside their jackets. Damian raised a single finger. The men sat back down. "You left this at my shop?" Naomi said, her voice tight but steady. Damian looked at the check, then up at her. "I heard you had a boiler problem. Consider it an advance on future dry cleaning." $50,000 buys a lot of dry cleaning, Mr. Russo." "I have a lot of clothes." "No." Naomi leaned in, bracing her hands on the table. She was close enough to smell his cologne, sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone. "Listen to me very carefully. I am not a charity case. I am not a pet project. And I am absolutely not for sale. You bought my building. Fine. I will pay my rent on the 1st of the month, just like I always do. But if you ever send one of your lapdogs to my shop with a bribe disguised as a gift again, I will close the business, pack my bags, and leave this city. Do you understand me?" Damian didn't move. He absorbed her anger like a sponge. His dark eyes flicked over her face, taking in the damp hair plastered to her cheek, the furious flush in her pale skin, the faint burn scar on her wrist from a careless press. He was surrounded by yes-men, sycophants. People who would kill for a scrap of his attention, let alone his money. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone traded their dignity for a piece of his power. And here was this tired, broke dry cleaner, threatening to blow up her entire life just to avoid being in his debt. "You're a very stubborn woman, Miss Hayes," Damien said quietly. "I'm a survivor," Naomi shot back, "and I don't survive by standing under falling anvils. Keep your money." She turned on her heel and walked out. Damien sat in the silence she left behind. He picked up the check. He folded it slowly, methodically, until it was a small, crisp square. The jazz music swelled around him, but all he could hear was the echo of her voice. "Stop trying to buy a receipt for my soul." He took a sip of his drink. The scotch tasted bitter. For the first time in his life, Damien Russo felt completely, utterly out of his depth. The following Tuesday, the bell above the door of Hayes Custom Care rattled. Naomi didn't look up from the ledger. She was trying to figure out how to stretch a small business loan from a legitimate, albeit predatory bank to cover the new boiler installation. The shop was freezing. She wore a thick wool sweater and fingerless gloves. "I'll be right with you," she muttered, crossing out a line of numbers. "Take your time." The voice hit her like a physical weight. Deep, resonant, calm. Naomi's head snapped up. Damien was standing on the other side of the counter. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore dark jeans, a heavy black sweater, and a leather jacket. He looked less like a mob boss and more like a man who worked with his hands, except for the eyes. "Rent isn't due for 2 weeks, Naomi said, her guard instantly up. She reached for the heavy shears under the counter on instinct, then forced her hand to relax. Damien placed a plastic bag on the counter. "I didn't come for rent." Naomi stared at the bag. "If there's a severed hand in there, I'm calling the police. I don't care who you are." A sharp, breathy sound escaped Damien. It took Naomi a second to realize it was a laugh. It was rusty, like he didn't use it much. No severed hands, just a sweater. Someone spilled coffee on it. Naomi narrowed her eyes. She pulled the bag forward and opened it. Inside was a standard cashmere V-neck. Tan. There was, indeed, a large coffee stain down the front. No blood, no bullet holes, just coffee. She looked at him suspiciously. "You own half the city. You probably have a live-in staff to do your laundry." "They don't do it right," Damien lied smoothly. He leaned against the counter. He didn't seem in a rush to leave. Naomi pulled the yellow ticket roll toward her. "Cashmere, hand wash and block dry. $30. "Fine. Up front." Damien reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out an envelope. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracted exactly $30, and set it on the counter. No extra 50, no tip. Naomi printed the receipt, stamped it, and handed him the claim ticket. "Friday." "Friday," Damien agreed. He took the ticket. But he didn't turn to leave. He stood there watching her. "Is there something else, Mr. Russo?" "Damien." "Mr. Russo," Naomi repeated firmly. "I have a ledger to balance and a shop to run." "It's freezing in here," he noted, his gaze drifting to her fingerless gloves. "Boiler is being installed tomorrow. I managed to secure a loan from the bank. A real bank." She emphasized the word real. 12% interest is steep," Damien said casually. Naomi froze. "How did you know my interest rate?" "I own the bank, too." Naomi dropped her pen. She stared at him, a sudden burning frustration welling up in her chest. Is this a game to you? Are you just bored? Do you get off on cornering people and watching them squirm? Damien's expression sobered immediately. The faint trace of amusement vanished. He stood up straight, the casual posture dissolving into something intense and focused. "No," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's not a game. I'm not trying to corner you, Naomi." "Then what are you doing here?" she demanded, stepping closer to the counter. "You don't need me to clean your coffee stains. You don't need to be standing in a freezing dry cleaner's in the South End. What do you want?" Damien looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the tension in her jaw, the fierce, unyielding pride in her eyes. He thought about the $50,000 he had offered her, a sum that would have changed her life, and how she had thrown it back in his face, because her freedom mattered more. He had spent his whole life manipulating leverage, finding what people wanted, what they feared, and using it to control them. He didn't know how to interact with someone who refused to play on the board. "I don't know," Damien said softly. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. Naomi blinked, thrown off balance by the raw sincerity in his voice. The aggression drained out of her, replaced by a weary confusion. She rubbed her temples. "You're a dangerous man, Damien. I'm just trying to keep my head above water. Please, let me drown in peace." "I'm not going to let you drown," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a vow. "I don't want your help. I know." He stepped back from the counter, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "That's exactly why I trust you." He turned and walked to the door. He pulled it open, the bell clattering overhead. He paused in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. The cold wind whipped into the shop, rustling the plastic garment bags. "I'll see you Friday, Naomi." He walked out into the gray afternoon. Naomi stood perfectly still for a long time, the cold seeping through her wool sweater. She looked down at the $30 on the counter. 2 10s and 2 5s. Perfectly ordinary. She felt a strange, terrifying flutter in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was something infinitely more dangerous. She picked up the money and locked it in the register, the heavy clack of the drawer echoing in the empty, freezing shop. The transaction was normal, but the way he had looked at her, that wasn't about the laundry. It wasn't about power. It was about gravity. And Naomi had the sinking realization that she was already caught in his pull. The new boiler purred like a massive iron cat in the basement. Heat radiated up through the floorboards, fogging the front windows and making the shop smell distinctly of hot dust and clean starch. It was a good smell. It was the smell of a business that was actually surviving. It was Friday, just past 5. Naomi was dealing with a headache that started right behind her eyes and the agitated voice of Arthur Pendleton, a mid-level corporate lawyer who believed volume equated to being right. "I brought this in pristine," Pendleton barked, shoving a crumpled light blue silk dress shirt across the counter. "You shrunk it, and now it looks like it belongs on a child. I want the cost of the shirt refunded. It's Bryony. $200. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She pulled the shirt toward her, flipping the collar to check the tag. "Mr. Pendleton, this is not Bryony. It's a polyester blend from a department store. Furthermore, the intake slip you signed explicitly states we warned you about previous heat damage to the fibers." She tapped the yellow copy taped to his bag. "You tried to iron it at home, melted the synthetic weave, and brought it here hoping I could unmelt it with steam." Pendleton's face flushed an ugly mottled red. Are you calling me a liar? I'm telling you what the fabric says, and the fabric doesn't lie. I want to speak to the owner. You are. Pendleton slammed his hand on the counter, making the jar of safety pins rattle. Listen here, you little... The bell above the door chimed. The shift in the room was instantaneous. It was an atmospheric drop in pressure. Pendleton stopped mid-tirade, the hair on the back of his neck standing up as a heavy silence swallowed his bluster. Naomi looked past the angry lawyer. Damien was standing just inside the doorway. He wore a dark navy overcoat against the November chill, his hands buried deep in the pockets. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look angry. He just stared at Pendleton with the dead, impassive eyes of a man calculating the exact weight of a corpse. Pendleton swallowed hard. The flush drained from his face, leaving him a waxy gray. He didn't know who Damien was, but survival instinct was universal. You know what? Pendleton stammered, grabbing his ruined shirt. Keep the damn thing. Forget it. He turned and practically bolted past Damien, nearly tripping over his own loafers as he pushed through the glass door and scurried down the sidewalk. Naomi let out a long, slow breath. She rubbed her temples, feeling the pulse of her headache. Damien walked up to the counter. He placed a familiar yellow claim ticket on the laminate. Next to it, he set a white paper cup. Steam drifted from the plastic lid. I had it handled, Naomi said, eyeing the cup. I know. Damien didn't offer a defense. Black coffee, 2 sugars. The guy at the bodega on the corner said that's your usual. Naomi stopped rubbing her temples. She looked from the coffee to him. You've been interrogating the bodega clerk? I asked a question while buying a pack of gum. It wasn't an interrogation. He was telling the truth, or at least his version of it. Naomi pulled the cup toward her. The warmth seeped into her palms. She took a sip. It was perfect. Hot, bitter, sweet enough to cut the edge off the day. Thank you, she muttered. She turned to the racks behind her, thumbing through the alphabetized hanging bags until she found the cashmere V-neck. She laid it on the counter. The coffee stain was completely gone. Damien didn't reach for it. He watched her. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was just quiet. He's right, you know, Damien said softly. Naomi frowned. Who? Pendleton? Absolutely not. That shirt was a cheap blend. Not him. You. You had it handled? Damien reached out, his knuckles brushing the plastic wrapping of his sweater. I shouldn't have stepped in. I'm used to fixing things when I walk into a room, usually by breaking something else. I'm trying to adjust. The confession hung in the warm, starchy air. Naomi looked at his hands. They were large, scarred across the knuckles, hands built for violence. Yet they were resting gently against the thin plastic, perfectly still. He was trying. It was a terrifying thought. A man like Damien Russo didn't bend to fit the world. He broke the world to fit him. But here he was, apologizing for intimidating a bully on her behalf, because he realized it undermined her authority in her own shop. Pendleton is a jerk, Naomi said quietly. But he's a harmless jerk. My business relies on harmless jerks keeping their accounts open. If my customers think the mob is my bouncer, they stop coming. I'm not the mob, Damien corrected. I'm independent. Naomi gave a dry, cynical laugh. Oh, my apologies. The Independent Organized Crime Syndicate. A faint smile touched the corner of Damien's mouth. It's a crucial distinction for tax purposes. He picked up the sweater. He didn't linger. He knew better than to push his luck. Have a good weekend, Naomi. Tuesday? She asked before she could stop herself. Damien paused at the door. He turned, the neon light from the window catching the sharp angle of his jaw. Tuesday. When the door closed, Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She took another sip of the coffee. It burned the whole way down. A deep, unsettling warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the drink. She was looking forward to Tuesday. That was the problem. Routine is a dangerous sedative. It lulls you into a false sense of security, smoothing over the jagged edges of reality until you forget they can still cut you. For a month the routine held. Tuesday drop-off, Friday pickup. Sometimes it was a coat. Sometimes it was a stack of shirts. Damien never paid in $100 bills anymore. He paid exact change. He asked about the boiler. She complained about the cost of commercial detergent. 10 minutes of absolute normalcy, twice a week, carved out of 2 lives that had no business intersecting. Then came the second Tuesday in December. It was sleeting, a nasty mix of rain and ice that kept the streets empty. Naomi was in the back room, wrestling a heavy wool blanket out of the commercial extractor. The front bell violently smashed against the glass. Naomi flinched, dropping the heavy wet wool into the rolling bin. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out into the front of the shop. 2 men were standing by the register. They weren't wearing bespoke suits. They wore heavy leather jackets, smelled like stale beer and cheap tobacco, and carried themselves with a loose, jagged aggression. The taller one, a guy with a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck, was holding a bottle of her expensive enzyme cleaner. He casually tipped it over, letting the thick blue liquid pool over her intake ledger. "Hey!" Naomi snapped, stepping forward. The shorter one turned. He had a flat, broken nose and cold eyes. "You the Hayes girl?" "I'm the owner. Get out of my shop." Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice stayed flat. She slid her hand along the edge of the counter, inching toward the heavy shears resting out of sight. "Relax, sweetheart," the tattooed man drawled. He dropped the empty bottle on the floor. It rolled under a rack of dresses. "We're just here to deliver a message. I don't take messages. I take laundry." Her fingers brushed the cold iron of the shears. The shorter man took a step forward, invading her space. The smell of him made her stomach roll. "See, word on the street is, Russo's been spending a lot of time down here, getting his delicates washed. We just wanted to see what the attraction was." He looked her up and down, his lip curling into a sneer. "Gotta admit, I don't see it. You're a little plain for a guy who owns the Velvet Room." "Maybe he just likes his clothes clean," Naomi said. She gripped the shears handle. "Maybe," the tattooed man said. He grabbed a handful of clothes hanging on the nearest rack, 3 customer coats, and yanked. The metal rack groaned, tipped, and crashed to the floor. Hangers snapped. Freshly pressed fabric tumbled into the dirt and melted sleet pooling on the linoleum. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second. Hours of work. Ruined. "Here's the message," the short man said, leaning over the counter. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't need to. The threat radiating off him was physical enough. "Tell Russo the South End is closed for his particular brand of business. If he wants to expand, he better negotiate with the local unions. If he doesn't—" The man gestured to the fallen rack. "Well, accidents happen in nice little shops like this." Fires. Broken glass. It'd be a shame. They didn't wait for a response. They turned and walked out into the sleet, the bell clattering behind them. Naomi stood frozen for a full minute. Her hand was clamped so tightly around the shears her knuckles were white. The silence of the shop rushed back in, broken only by the hiss of the radiator and the dripping of the ruined coats on the floor. Slowly, she let go of the shears. Her hands started to shake. A deep, violent tremor that traveled up her arms and seized her chest. She sank to the floor behind the counter, pulling her knees to her chest, and pressed her face into her apron. She didn't cry. She was too angry to cry. She was angry at the men. She was angry at the ruined clothes. Most of all, she was angry at Damien for bringing his world through her front door. Damien arrived the next day at exactly noon. Naomi hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night re-cleaning and pressing the coats, scrubbing the blue enzyme cleaner off her ledger, and sweeping up the dirt. When the bell chimed, she didn't look up from the steaming press. "Give me a minute." Damien stepped in. He didn't have any clothes in his hands. He took 3 steps into the shop and stopped. Naomi felt his gaze moving over the room. He noticed everything. He noticed the faint blue stain on the edge of the ledger. He noticed that the rack near the door was bent slightly to the left. He noticed the dark bags under her eyes and the tight, rigid way she held her shoulders. Who was it? Damien's voice wasn't loud, but it stripped all the oxygen out of the room. It was flat, hollow, and utterly terrifying. Naomi pressed down on the steam pedal. A cloud of white vapor shot up, obscuring her face. Nobody. Naomi. The word wasn't a request. She turned off the press and turned to face him. He looked like the man who had walked in that first night with the bloody coat. The quiet, gentle customer who brought her coffee was gone. The apex predator was back, standing in her shop, his posture vibrating with a lethal, contained energy. 2 guys, Naomi said, her voice sounding brittle in her own ears. Leather jackets. One had a spiderweb tattoo on his neck. They knocked over a rack, spilled some soap. Did they touch you? The question was clipped, barely human. No. Damien's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked near his temple. What did they say? They said to tell you the South End is closed, that you need to negotiate with the local unions, or accidents might happen to my shop. Naomi crossed her arms, wrapping them tightly around her ribs. This is exactly why I didn't want your money, Damien. This is exactly why I told you to stay away. I am not a piece on your board. I'm collateral. You are not collateral, Damien snapped. It was the first time she had ever heard him raise his voice. It echoed off the walls. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, stopping just short of the counter. They are dead men. They just don't know it yet. Naomi's blood ran cold. No, Damien. You don't get to do that. They threatened you. They threatened your territory. That's what I am to them. And if you go out there and kill 2 thugs over a dry cleaner, it proves them right. It paints a giant target on my back. She leaned forward, meeting his dark, furious eyes. I am a civilian. I want to stay a civilian. If you want to protect me, you leave it alone. You stay away from me. Damien stared at her. The violence inside him was a physical thing, a storm raging just beneath his skin, demanding a release. He had built an empire by answering every slight with overwhelming force. Restraint felt like acid in his veins. But looking at Naomi, seeing the genuine fear mixing with her iron-willed defiance. The storm broke against the rocks of her boundary. "I can't stay away," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I tried. Before I started coming back with the coffee, I tried. I lasted 4 days." Naomi's breath hitched. The raw honesty in his face stripped away all her defenses. "I will handle the unions," Damien said, his tone shifting into something cold, calculating, and final. "Without blood. I will make sure they understand that this shop and the woman inside it are off limits. I will fix this, Naomi, my way. But I am not walking out that door and never coming back." He reached across the counter. He didn't grab her. He just laid his hand flat on the laminate, palm up. An invitation. Naomi looked at his scarred hand. She knew exactly what he was. She knew the darkness he carried. But as she looked at him, she realized she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid of the world he brought with him, yes. But she wasn't afraid of the man. Slowly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his palm. His hand closed around hers, warm, calloused, and unyielding. It felt like an anchor. It felt like the point of no return. Violence is efficient. It is a straight line between a problem and a solution. Bureaucracy, on the other hand, is exhausting. For a man accustomed to the former, the latter felt like trying to dismantle a bomb with his hands tied behind his back. Damien sat at the heavy oak desk in the back office of the Velvet Room. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and bitter espresso. Leo stood near the door, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He had a suppressed Sig Sauer in his shoulder holster and a deeply confused expression on his face. "I don't understand, boss," Leo said cautiously. "O'Bannon's guys walked into her shop. They wrecked her inventory. They threatened her. We have the green light to put them in the ground. I can have a crew at their warehouse in 20 minutes. "No crew," Damien said. He didn't look up from the stack of financial dossiers spread across his desk. He traced a line of red ink with the tip of a silver pen. "I told her there would be no blood. I intend to keep my word." Leo frowned. "O'Bannon's going to see that as weakness. If you don't hit back hard, the other local bosses are going to think you've lost your edge." Damien finally looked up. His eyes were cold, flat, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Leo, I'm going to hit back. I'm just going to use a different weapon." He slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood. "O'Bannon uses 3 shell companies to launder his union kickbacks," Damien explained, his voice low and rhythmic. "A trucking firm, a waste management outfit, and a commercial real estate holding group. By tomorrow morning, I want the trucking firm's fleet grounded for phantom EPA violations. I want the waste management contract revoked by the city council. And I want the bank to call in the loans on every single one of his real estate properties." Leo picked up the folder, staring at the pages of complex financial sabotage. "You're going to bankrupt him." "I am going to erase him," Damien corrected. "I am going to take away his money, his leverage, and his pride. And when he comes crawling here begging for a loan to keep his house, I am going to make him sign over his territory to me. All of it." Damien stood up, walking over to the small wet bar to pour a glass of water. "Violence makes noise, Leo. Noise draws cops. Cops draw heat to the South End. I want the South End quiet. I want it so quiet you can hear a pin drop. Do you understand?" Leo nodded slowly, a new kind of respect dawning in his eyes. He realized then that Damien wasn't going soft. He was evolving. And a predator that learns to adapt is infinitely more dangerous than one that relies only on its teeth. I'll make the calls. The shift in the neighborhood was not explosive. It was atmospheric. 3 days after the incident with the coats, Naomi was out front, sweeping the sidewalk in the early morning frost. She saw him from half a block away, the man with the spiderweb tattoo. Her grip tightened on the broom handle. Her heart gave a hard, painful thud against her ribs. She looked around, calculating the distance to the door, the time it would take to turn the deadbolt. The man kept walking toward her. But his posture was entirely different. His shoulders were slumped. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of a cheap denim jacket. He looked pale, gaunt, and terrified. He stopped 10 feet away from the edge of her sidewalk. He didn't step onto the concrete in front of the shop. He treated the property line like a high-voltage wire. Naomi didn't move. She held the broom like a spear. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing over the faded ink on his neck. "Miss Hayes, what do you want?" Naomi's voice cracked like a whip in the cold air. He shifted nervously, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting a sniper to take him out. "I came to apologize for the mess, for the disrespect." It was out of line. Naomi stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the moment rooted her to the spot. A hardened union enforcer, a man who broke legs for a living, was standing on a freezing sidewalk apologizing to a dry cleaner. "Mr. Russo," the man stammered, rubbing his jaw. He bought my boss out. Yesterday. The whole operation. We work for him now. And his first order was that I come down here and tell you that this block is a sanctuary zone. Nobody touches the shop. Nobody breathes heavy in your direction. If you have a problem, you call the club and we handle it." He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the frozen ground. It landed near Naomi's boots. "That's for the ruined coats," he mumbled. "From my own pocket. I'm sorry." He turned and walked away, his pace hurried, desperate to put distance between himself and her. Naomi looked down at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She looked down the empty street, watching the man disappear around the corner. The silence of the morning felt heavy, thick with unseen architecture. Damien had kept his word. There was no blood on the pavement. There were no sirens. Just a quiet, terrifying demonstration of absolute control. She bent down, picked up the envelope, and walked back inside, locking the door behind her. She leaned against the glass, letting out a long, ragged breath. He was wrapping his world around hers, shielding her from the collateral damage. It was the most romantic, terrifying thing anyone had ever done for her. Friday night arrived with a bitter, biting wind that rattled the front windows of Hayes Custom Care. Naomi flipped the sign to closed and began the tedious process of shutting down the machines. The heavy clatter of the presses falling silent echoed in the empty shop. She wiped down the front counter, her eyes drifting to the clock. 6:30. The bell chimed. Naomi didn't flinch this time. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps. Damien stepped inside, pushing the heavy glass door shut against the wind. He wore a dark wool peacoat over a charcoal sweater, his collar turned up against the cold. His cheeks were slightly flushed from the chill, making him look surprisingly human. "Shop's closed," Naomi said, but she didn't sound angry. Damien walked up to the counter. He didn't have a plastic garment bag. He didn't have a coffee cup. He stood there, his hands resting on the laminate edge, looking at her with an intensity that made the small hairs on her arms stand up. "I'm out of dirty clothes," Damien said. A small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Naomi's mouth. "That's a tragedy for my profit margins. I could buy a new suit and drag it behind my car if it helps. Please don't. The enzyme treatments are expensive." Naomi leaned against the counter, mirroring his posture. The space between them was barely 2 feet, filled with a static electricity that had been building for weeks. The man with the tattoo came by. Damien's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. Did he cause a problem? He apologized, left an envelope for the damages. Looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Naomi tilted her head, studying him. "You didn't hurt them. I broke their bank accounts. It heals slower than a broken nose." Damien's gaze dropped to her hands, tracing the faint burn scar on her wrist. "I told you I would fix it my way." "You did." Naomi swallowed, the dry heat of the shop suddenly feeling a little too close. "Thank you for keeping it quiet." "You don't need to thank me for basic maintenance, Naomi." He looked back up, catching her eyes. "I didn't come here to talk about O'Bannon's crew." "Why did you come?" "To ask you to dinner." The words hung in the air, simple and devastatingly direct. No games, no leverage, just a question. Naomi's heart gave a slow, heavy thump. "Dinner?" "Yes." Damien shifted slightly, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "Not at my club. Not anywhere in the South End. Just dinner. You and me. As civilians." Naomi looked at him. She thought about the $50,000 check she had thrown in his face. She thought about the bloody coat. She thought about the men in leather jackets. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to say no, to maintain the boundary, to hide behind the safety of the dry cleaning counter. But then she looked at the way he was waiting for her answer. The man who owned the city was standing in a shabby shop, holding his breath. "Let me get my coat," Naomi said. Damien didn't bring the town car. He drove a restored 1970 Chevelle, painted a deep midnight blue. It rumbled with a mechanical purr that felt grounded, lacking the sterile perfection of a chauffeured limousine. He drove them across the bridge, out of the city's immediate grip, to a small, unassuming Italian restaurant nestled in a quiet suburb. It was dimly lit, smelling of garlic, roasted tomatoes, and old wood. There were no bouncers at the door. Nobody looked twice at Damien when he walked in. To the rest of the room, they were just a couple escaping the cold. They sat in a booth near the back. The waiter brought warm bread and poured them glasses of a heavy, dry red wine. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was tentative. They talked about the weather, the traffic, the trivial things that regular people discussed. It felt foreign to both of them, like trying to speak a language they had only read in books. Finally, Damien set his wine glass down. He looked at her across the flickering candlelight. $50,000, he said quietly. Naomi stopped buttering her bread. She met his gaze, her expression guarded. "Are we really doing this? I need to know." Damien pressed, his voice gentle but insistent. "I've spent my entire life dealing with people who would sell their own mothers for a fraction of that amount. You were drowning. Your business was freezing. And you looked at that check like it was a live grenade. Why?" Naomi sighed, placing the knife down on her plate. She looked at the candle flame, watching the wax melt and pool. "Because to me, it was." She took a slow sip of her wine, buying time to organize the memories she usually kept locked away in a dark, quiet box. "My father owned a hardware store," Naomi began, her voice low. "When I was 19, the big box stores moved in. He started losing money, desperate money. So he went to a man who ran a pawn shop 3 blocks over, a man connected to your world." Damien didn't interrupt. He sat perfectly still, absorbing every word. "He borrowed $30,000, Naomi continued. "By the time the interest hit, it was 60, then 90. He worked 18-hour days. He sold the house. He sold my mother's jewelry. He aged 20 years and 20 months. She looked up, her eyes bright with a fierce old pain. "He died of a massive heart attack behind the counter of a store he didn't even own anymore. The man from the pawn shop came to his funeral. He told me the debt was forgiven." A heavy silence settled over the table. The clatter of silverware from the other diners felt miles away. "I swore on his grave," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "that I would never owe a single dime to anyone. I would rather freeze to death in my shop than take money that comes with a chain attached. Your envelope wasn't a gift, Damien. It was a collar, and I refused to wear one." Damien looked at her. He saw the iron spine beneath the exhausted exterior. He saw the trauma that fueled her independence. He understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that trying to buy her was the greatest insult he could have ever offered. He reached across the table. He didn't ask for permission. He just slid his hand over hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm sorry," Damien said. The words were heavy, carrying the weight of a genuine apology for the arrogance he had shown in the beginning. "I didn't know. But I see you now, Naomi. I see you." Naomi looked down at their joined hands. The warmth of his skin seeped into hers, anchoring her. She didn't pull away. "I know you do," she said softly. For the first time since they met, there was no transaction between them. No clothes, no money, no threats. Just a profound, quiet understanding. The wall between them hadn't just cracked. It had crumbled completely. And as they sat there in the dim light of the restaurant, Damien knew he was entirely, hopelessly compromised. February arrived with teeth, coating the sidewalks in a brittle layer of gray ice. The city felt hollowed out by the cold, but inside Hayes' custom care, the air was thick and warm. The dynamic between Naomi and Damien had shifted into something unspoken but undeniable. He still brought his laundry on Tuesdays. He still picked it up on Fridays. But the transactions had lost their sharp transactional edge. Now, Damien often lingered. He would sit on the worn stool behind the counter, reading financial reports on his tablet, while the heavy industrial presses hissed and clanked. He didn't bring his world into the shop, and Naomi didn't ask about the bruises that sometimes darkened his jawline. They existed in a fragile, insulated bubble of domesticity. It was a dangerous illusion, and they both knew it. It shattered on a Thursday night. Naomi was closing up late. The streets were dead, the street lamps casting long skeletal shadows across the slush. Damien had insisted on walking her to her car, parked 2 blocks down because of a broken water main on her street. They walked in silence, their shoulders brushing. The cold bit through Naomi's wool coat, but the proximity to Damien felt like a furnace. They turned the corner onto Elm. That was when the shadows moved. 3 men detached themselves from the mouth of a dark alleyway. They didn't look like local muscle. They wore heavy, unmarked tactical jackets, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. There was no swagger, no drunken posturing. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency. Damien stopped dead. The casual relaxation drained from his body in a fraction of a second. His arm shot out, catching Naomi mid-stride and shoving her hard behind his back. "Get against the brick," he ordered. His voice was a low, mechanical rasp. "Don't move. Don't look." Naomi hit the brick wall of the adjacent building. The cold seeped through her coat instantly. Her breath hitched, turning to white mist in the freezing air. She didn't scream. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the panic was cold and sharp. "Russo," the man in the center said. He had a flat Midwestern accent. "Chicago, maybe. You've been making a lot of noise in the supply chains. Our employers feel a change in management is required. Your employer should have sent better men," Damien said. The man in the center reached inside his coat. "Violence is a language. Most men only know how to shout it, flailing and loud." Damien whispered it. He didn't wait for the gun to clear the man's jacket. Damien lunged. He crossed the 6 feet of icy pavement in a single, explosive movement. He grabbed the center man's wrist, twisting it violently upward. A sickening crack echoed in the quiet street. The man dropped, a strangled gasp escaping his lips as the heavy pistol clattered onto the ice. The other two reacted, lunging forward. Damien didn't step back. He stepped into them. He used the falling man as a pivot, driving his elbow into the throat of the man on his left. The impact was dense and wet. The man collapsed, clutching his neck, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man threw a wild, desperate punch. Damien slipped beneath it, pivoting on his heel. He drove a fist into the man's floating ribs, followed instantly by a sweeping kick that took the man's legs out from under him. The thug hit the frozen concrete with a thud that shook the snow from the nearby awning. It was over in less than 10 seconds. 3 men were on the ground, incapacitated, groaning, or unconscious. Damien stood over them, his chest heaving slightly, his breath pluming in the dark. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't shouted. He turned slowly to look at Naomi. The street lamp illuminated his face. His eyes were entirely black, dilated with adrenaline and the primal instinct to kill. His hands were curled into tight fists, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the impact against teeth and bone. He looked like the monster the city whispered about. He waited for her to scream. He waited for the revulsion, for the inevitable terror that would send her running back to the safety of her normal life. He had finally shown her the ugly, brutal truth of what it took to survive in his world. Naomi stared at him. She looked at the men writhing on the ground. She looked at the gun resting on the ice. Then she looked back at Damien's bleeding knuckles. She pushed herself off the brick wall. Her legs felt heavy, but she didn't run away. She walked forward, stepping carefully over the man clutching his throat, until she was standing inches from Damien. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. Damien blinked, the lethal focus snapping as confusion flooded his system. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "Naomi, they were going to—" "I know what they were going to do," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. She reached out, her pale fingers wrapping gently around his thick, scarred wrist. She didn't flinch away from the blood. "My car's in the next lot. Let's go." She pulled him away from the wreckage. Damien followed, entirely disarmed by the woman who had just watched him dismantle 3 men and decided the most pressing issue was his scraped knuckles. The back room of Hayes Custom Care smelled like peroxide and bleach. Naomi sat Damien on the edge of the large wooden folding table. The single overhead bulb cast a harsh yellow light over them. She had locked the front door, pulled the steel security grate down, and turned off the neon sign. The shop was a fortress. She soaked a cotton pad in rubbing alcohol and pressed it firmly against the gash on his right knuckle. Damien hissed, his jaw tightening, not from the pain of the alcohol, but from the searing intimacy of the moment. He watched her face. She was pale, her brow furrowed in concentration as she meticulously cleaned the wound. There was no judgment in her eyes, just a grim, practical focus. "I should have had a car waiting," Damien said, his voice rough. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, heavy guilt. "I got careless. I thought the route was secure." "They were waiting for you," Naomi noted, tossing the bloody cotton pad into the trash. "Not me. It doesn't matter. You were there. You were in the crossfire." Damien pulled his hand away from her grasp. He stood up, pacing the narrow aisle between the rolling racks of clothes. The small space suddenly felt suffocating. "This is exactly what you warned me about. The first day I walked in here, you told me you didn't want my world in your shop. And tonight, it almost got you killed." "Almost is a big word," Naomi countered, reaching for a roll of gauze. "Don't minimize this, Naomi," Damien snapped, turning on his heel to face her. "Those were Chicago contractors. They don't play by the local rules. They will come back. And next time, they won't try to have a conversation first. They'll just shoot." He reached into his heavy overcoat. He pulled out a black leather wallet, his movements jerky and agitated. He tossed it onto the folding table. It landed with a heavy final thud next to the first aid kit. "There's a debit card in there, no limit, untraceable," Damien said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a CEO liquidating an asset. "Leo has a contact in real estate. We can have you on a plane to Portland or Seattle by morning. You can open a new shop, buy a house, whatever you want. You disappear, and they lose their leverage." Naomi stared at the wallet. It was happening again. The fundamental disconnect. When Damien was cornered, when he felt he was losing control, he threw money at the problem. He built walls out of cash and distance. A slow, burning anger ignited in Naomi's chest. She didn't touch the wallet. She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with a fierce, quiet intensity. "So, that's it?" Naomi asked. "Things get messy, and your solution is to buy me a one-way ticket and pretend I never existed?" "My solution is keeping you alive," Damien fired back. "You're a civilian, Naomi. You fix clothes. You don't know how to survive this. I survived 30 years in the South End before you walked through my door." Naomi slammed her hand down on the table, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. "I survived debt and grief and men who thought they could take whatever they wanted from me. Don't you dare patronize me by acting like you're my only chance at survival." Damien stopped pacing. He stared at her, caught off guard by the sheer force of her anger. Naomi picked up the wallet. She didn't throw it at him. She walked over to where he stood, grabbed the lapel of his overcoat, and shoved the wallet forcefully back into his inside pocket. "This is the third time you've tried to pay me off, Damien," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She stepped into his space, her chin tilted up to meet his eyes. "And for the third time, the answer is no. I don't want your envelope. I don't want your blank check. And I certainly don't want a plane ticket to Portland." "Naomi, You don't understand the danger." "I understand perfectly," she cut him off. Her hands moved from his lapels to rest flat against his chest. She could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart through the thick wool. "I watched you break a man's neck tonight. I know exactly what you are. I know the blood on your ledger." "Then why aren't you running?" Damien asked, his voice cracking slightly. The apex predator, the man who owned the city, looked completely broken. "I stain everything I touch, Naomi. If you stay, I'll pull you down into the dark." Naomi's expression softened, but the iron in her spine remained rigid. She slid her hands up, resting her palms against his cold cheeks. "I'm a dry cleaner, Damien," Naomi whispered. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. "I don't run from a little blood. I scrub it out. I fix things. That's what I do. And you are not a ruined coat. You're just a man who forgot how to live in the light." Damien closed his eyes, a shudder ripping through his heavy frame. The defensive walls he had spent a lifetime building collapsed into dust. He didn't have any leverage left. He didn't have any bribes to offer. He only had the one thing he had never given to anyone else: himself. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of clean starch and warm skin. It was an anchor. It was home. "I can't lose you," he murmured against her collarbone. "You won't," Naomi promised, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "But you have to stop trying to buy me. If you want me, you have to earn me, every single day." Damien lifted his head. He looked down at her, his dark eyes burning with a new, terrifying kind of clarity. There was no transaction here. There was only surrender. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't safe. It tasted of metallic adrenaline, cold winter air, and desperate, overwhelming need. Naomi kissed him back with equal ferocity, rising on her toes, letting the heat of him burn away the remnants of the freezing night. He was danger. He was violence. He was a complication she could barely afford. But as his hands held her like she was the only real thing left in his world, Naomi knew she had already paid the ultimate price. She had given him her heart, and no amount of money could ever buy it back. That's how Naomi and Damien's story ends, not with a transaction, but with a total surrender. Naomi proved that true power isn't about how much money you can throw at a problem, but about the boundaries you refuse to compromise. And Damien finally learned that the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be earned with blood, trust, and absolute honesty. What did you think of Naomi's final stand? Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional, gritty romance stories. See you in the next one.